The little black girl knocked on the biker's cabin saying her stepfather met a minor in secret last evening. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. It was a crisp evening in late autumn when Maya, a frightened little girl of about 10, ran through the woods toward the isolated cabin of the Thunderwolves Motorcycle Club. Her small, trembling hands clutched the edges of her torn coat as she stumbled over fallen branches and thick underbrush. Tears streaked down her dark face, mixing with the dirt that had accumulated from the long run. Her heart pounded in her chest, but it wasn't from exhaustion. She had to find them, the bikers, her last hope. She was scared, and she needed their help. As she neared the cabin, she gasped for breath, her body shivering not only from the cold, but from the dread that filled her every step. The cabin, tucked away deep in the woods, was a refuge to the men and women of the Thunder Wolves, a group of tough bikers who had long since left their troubled past behind. They now used their skills and loyalty to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. Maya had heard the stories, seen the patch on the backs of the bikers as they drove through her neighborhood, their engines rumbling like thunder, a promise of safety for anyone who needed it. She knocked on the door with urgency, her small fist pounding against the wood, though she wasn't sure anyone would even hear her. She needed them. She had to warn them. The door creaked open, revealing a massive figure standing in the dim light of the cabin. It was Forge, the leader of the Thunder Wolves, a man whose weathered face and battle-scarred hands told the story of a life full of hardship. But his eyes softened as soon as they landed on Maya, recognizing the terror in her eyes. Without a word, he stepped aside, allowing her to enter. The cold air rushed in behind her, and she flinched as she crossed the threshold. She was safe, for now. "What's wrong, kid?" Forge's deep voice was calm, but laced with concern. Maya's lips quivered as she tried to speak, but all that came out were broken sobs. She had to tell them, had to get the words out. Finally, between gasps, she managed to say, "My stepfather. He met someone, a minor, last evening, in secret." Forge's brow furrowed as he motioned for her to sit down on the worn leather couch. He crouched in front of her, his face hardening. "Who is this minor? What do you know about him?" Maya took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. "I overheard them. They were talking about a deal. A big one. They said it was for some land. But I heard my stepfather say something. He said he'd do whatever it took, even if it meant hurting people to get what he wanted." Forge's jaw tightened. This wasn't just a little girl's imagination running wild. Her words were too specific, too dangerous. The Thunder Wolves had seen enough corruption, enough bloodshed to know when someone was hiding something. "How long have you known about this?" Forge asked, his voice now taking on a sharper tone. "Only tonight," she replied. I tried to stop him. I tried to tell my mom, but she wouldn't listen. She said everything was fine." She paused, eyes downcast. "But he's been acting strange, and now I don't know if he's going to hurt someone." Forge stood up, his towering figure casting a shadow over the room. He turned to his crew, who had gathered around in the corner. Each of them knew the weight of what Maya had just revealed. "This isn't just about a bad stepfather," Forge said, his voice low and filled with anger. "We've got a man making deals with people who hurt others for money. And this little girl, is the one paying the price. We're not letting that happen. Not on our watch." The room was silent for a moment, the only sound being the low hum of the heater in the corner. Then, one by one, the bikers spoke. "I'm in," said Storm, a towering figure who was known for his strength, but also his soft heart. "We've got her back." "Count me in too," said Inferno, a former Marine with a heart for justice. "Let's ride." One by one, the Thunderwolves stood, their loyalty to the pack and their code of honor guiding them. Forge looked at Maya, who was now sitting quietly, her hands clasped together in her lap. "We'll protect you, kid. You don't have to worry about him anymore." Maya looked up at him, her eyes wide with disbelief and relief. For the first time that night, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, things were going to be okay. The Thunderwolves were ready to take action, and they wouldn't stop until they uncovered the truth, and kept Maya safe. The next morning, the sun had barely risen when Forge and the Thunder Wolves were already preparing to hit the road. The group had gathered in the cabin's living room, their leather vests and jackets glinting under the dim light from the overhead lamp. Maya, sitting quietly on the couch, her legs curled up under her, looked like a child lost in the world of adults. Her face was still pale from the fear of the night before, but now there was something else in her eyes, hope. Hope that these bikers, this strange new family, might be able to help her and her mother. Forge stood by the window, his broad back to the group, looking out over the barren landscape. It was a long ride ahead, but he knew they couldn't wait. "We're riding today," Forge said, his voice steady, filled with resolve. "We need to get to that mine. The more we know, the better." His tone carried a sense of urgency, but also a quiet confidence that the others trusted. Storm, Inferno, and the rest of the group nodded in agreement, their faces hard with determination. No one was going to hurt this girl, not while they were breathing. "What's the plan?" asked Phantom, the club's historian and strategist. He always liked to plan things carefully, thinking 5 steps ahead. "We head to the mine, but we don't make any noise. We follow the lead we have from Maya. If we can find out what her stepfather is really involved in, we'll know how to handle it," Forge said, his hand resting on the back of his chair. "We need to get Maya's mom out of there too. She's been through enough." The group broke into action, getting ready for the ride. The engines of their motorcycles roared to life as they pulled out of the cabin's driveway, the wind whipping through their hair and jackets as they hit the road. Maya stood at the door, watching them go, her heart pounding with a mix of fear and relief. For the first time in a long while, she felt like someone had her back. The Thunder Wolves had become her family, and she knew they were ready to face whatever danger lay ahead. The ride was long and grueling, stretching over 400 miles of winding roads, rocky hills, and barren fields. The sun was high in the sky as they made their way toward the mining town, their engines echoing off the empty land around them. The road was rough, and at times, the riders had to fight against the wind and dust, but they kept their pace steady. Maya, sitting behind Forge on his motorcycle, held on tightly to his waist, the cool breeze brushing against her face. She had never been on a ride like this before, and though she was still nervous, there was a part of her that felt safe. Almost there, Forge shouted over his shoulder, his voice cutting through the noise of the engines. "Stay sharp." As they neared the town, the air became thicker, and the atmosphere felt heavy with tension. The mine was located just outside the outskirts, tucked away in a valley between 2 towering cliffs. The area was quiet, too quiet. The only sounds were the distant hum of machinery and the occasional flutter of a bird's wings. They parked their bikes a few miles from the mine and approached on foot, carefully making their way through the trees and brush. Forge motioned for everyone to be silent, his eyes scanning the area. "Stay close," he whispered. "We're not here to make noise. We need to find out what's really going on here." They moved in a tight formation, using the cover of trees and rocks to hide their movements. As they reached the edge of the mine, they crouched down, peering through the brush to get a better look. There, in the distance, they saw it. A group of men standing around a fire, their faces hidden under the hoods of their jackets. One of them, a tall, broad-shouldered man, was speaking to someone Maya immediately recognized. It was her stepfather. His posture was rigid, and his voice was low, but there was no mistaking him. "That's him," Maya whispered, her heart racing in her chest. "He's the one who's been meeting with them." Forge nodded, his eyes narrowing. "We need to get closer. Let's see what they're talking about." Slowly and carefully, they moved closer, making sure to stay out of sight. As they approached, they could hear snippets of the conversation. Her stepfather was discussing something about a deal, something that involved a lot of money. "This is the real gold mine," the tall man said, his voice smooth and cold. "And if we can get the land, we'll be unstoppable. But we need to deal with the girl's family first. That's the only way." Forge's blood ran cold at the mention of Maya's family. He knew they were talking about her. This was much bigger than just a simple family issue. This was about power, money, and control. "We can't let them do this," Forge muttered. He turned to his crew, his face hard with determination. "We get in, we get the information, and we get out. Fast." They moved in even closer, trying to stay hidden in the shadows. But suddenly, Maya's stepfather turned and glanced in their direction. His eyes narrowed as he caught sight of something moving in the trees. "We're being watched," he growled. "Get ready." The thunder wolves froze, their hearts pounding in their chests. They had been discovered. And now, the real fight was about to begin. The moment Maya's stepfather caught sight of the thunder wolves, the air turned tense. His eyes narrowed, scanning the trees where Forge and the others were hiding. The group froze, not daring to move, their breath catching in their throats. The tall man by the fire gave a slight nod, and the men began to shuffle around, reaching for their weapons. "You can run, but you can't hide," Maya's stepfather muttered under his breath, his voice low but laced with menace. Forge's pulse quickened. The hunt was on. "We need to move. Now," Forge whispered urgently to his crew, signaling them to fall back into the shadows. Without a word, they turned, their movements swift and calculated, blending into the dense brush and trees. Maya, her heart racing, followed closely behind Forge. The sound of the men's voices and the crackling of the fire seemed to fade as they moved deeper into the woods. Forge's mind was working quickly, calculating their next move. They had to get away from the group before they were surrounded. "We can't let them get the drop on us," he muttered. Storm, the burly ex-con who had become Forge's right-hand man, nodded, his hand instinctively reaching for the pistol at his hip. "No way. Let's get ahead of them, cut them off before they know what hit him." The group continued to move, silently but with purpose, through the trees. They knew the land like the back of their hands, and with Forge leading the way, they quickly reached a ridge that overlooked the clearing where the men were still gathered around the fire. The sound of footsteps and the low voices grew closer. Forge motioned for everyone to stop, crouching down behind a thick cluster of bushes. He peered through the leaves, watching the men below. Maya's stepfather was talking to the tall man, gesturing angrily in the direction of the trees. "We know they're here. We can't let them slip away. Not this time," he said, his tone thick with frustration. The tall man, who had been silent until now, finally spoke up, his voice cold and calm. "We'll find them. And when we do, we'll make sure they don't get away again. This isn't just about the girl anymore. It's personal." Forge's blood ran cold. These men weren't just trying to silence Maya. They were after something much bigger, something far more dangerous. Forge's grip tightened around the hilt of his knife. They couldn't allow these men to get any closer. He looked around at his crew. "We're going in. No more hiding. We do this fast and clean. Keep it quiet until we make our move." The plan was simple: strike hard and fast, before the men could realize they were being outmaneuvered. With a final nod, Forge led the group down the ridge and into the thick brush, moving quickly but quietly. They crept through the underbrush, inching closer to the camp. Maya, still shaken but more resolute, stayed close to Forge. She had come to trust these bikers, and now, she needed them more than ever. They reached the clearing just as the men began to scatter, preparing to search the area for any sign of the Thunderwolves. Forge, Storm, Phantom, and the others split off into separate directions, each taking a position to block any possible escape routes. The air was thick with tension as they readied themselves for the confrontation. Forge's heart raced, but he knew what had to be done. They couldn't let these men take Maya or anyone else ever again. "On my signal," Forge whispered into his radio. "We move." The plan had been set, but now they had to act. The first movement came from Phantom, who darted out from behind a tree, taking down one of the guards with a swift and silent strike. The camp erupted into chaos as the bikers began to take control. Storm rushed forward, knocking out another guard, while Inferno tackled the tall man, pinning him to the ground. Maya's stepfather turned just in time to see Forge charging at him. With no hesitation, Forge slammed into him, knocking him to the dirt. The fight was brutal but quick. The men who had once been so confident were now overwhelmed by the Thunderwolves' precision and speed. As Forge pinned Maya's stepfather to the ground, his voice was low but commanding. "It's over. You're not taking her. Not today, not ever." The man struggled, his face contorted with rage, but he was no match for the bikers. "You think you can just waltz in and change everything?" he spat. "You don't understand. You don't know what's at stake." Forge's grip tightened. "I understand enough. And I'm not letting you hurt anyone else." The sound of the fight slowly died down as the last of the men were subdued. Forge stood up, his chest heaving with the adrenaline of the fight. He looked around at his crew, who were already securing the area. Maya's stepfather, now restrained, was glaring at them with a mix of fury and disbelief. "What happens now?" Maya asked quietly, her small voice barely audible over the noise of the camp. Forge knelt down beside her, his expression softening. "Now we get you out of here, and we make sure you're safe." But as Forge looked around at the wreckage of the camp, he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end. They had won this fight, but the war was far from over. Maya's stepfather had a plan, and he was just the tip of the iceberg. The Thunder Wolves would do whatever it took to protect Maya, but Forge knew that there were bigger forces at play, and the next battle could be even more dangerous than the one they had just won. The Thunder Wolves stood in the clearing, their breaths heavy from the fight, watching as Maya's stepfather struggled against the ropes that bound him. His face was bruised, his pride shattered, but it wasn't over yet. Forge stood next to Maya, his eyes scanning the camp, still on high alert. The night had been brutal, but they had won. They had gotten the girl away from the danger, but the deeper truth was far from uncovered. "What now?" Maya asked, her voice trembling. She was still a child, far too young to be caught up in a mess this big. But Forge knew there was no going back. "Now we move fast," Forge said, his tone calm but urgent. "We need to get you and your mom to safety, Maya, and then we get to the bottom of this." The bikers quickly loaded up the motorcycles, making sure Maya was safely in the back of Forge's bike, clutching him tightly as they rode. The roar of the engines faded into the night, but Forge's mind was still racing. The men they'd taken down weren't just random thugs. They were part of something much larger. And the way Maya's stepfather had talked, there was no doubt in Forge's mind that this wasn't just about a shady deal. It was about power, corruption, and the lives of innocent people caught in the middle. As they sped down the winding road, heading toward the town where Maya's mom was hiding, Forge's thoughts shifted. There were too many unanswered questions. The tall man by the fire, the one who had spoken with Maya's stepfather, seemed to be at the center of it all. Who was he? What was his connection to the land and the mining operation? Why had Maya's stepfather been so desperate to hide his dealings? When they reached the town, Forge immediately called for a meeting with the crew. The small town was quiet, almost eerily so, as if it was too scared to speak its own secrets. They parked their bikes in an alley behind a local diner and headed toward a small motel where Maya's mom was staying. Forge knocked on the door, his heart heavy with the knowledge that this wasn't the end. Maya's mother, Shauna, opened the door, her face pale and drawn. She had been through so much, yet there was a sense of relief in her eyes when she saw her daughter. The two embraced tightly, Maya's small frame shaking in her mother's arms. "It's okay, Mom. We're safe," Maya whispered. Shauna nodded, but her eyes were filled with worry. "What's next?" she asked, looking at Forge and the crew. "We need to keep you safe," Forge said, his voice firm. "There's something bigger going on here. These men, your husband, they're involved in something much more dangerous than we thought. We're going to get to the bottom of it, but you need to stay hidden." Shauna nodded again, her face pale with fear. "I know, but where do we go from here? Where can we hide?" Forge turned to the group. Storm stepped forward, his hands in his pockets, his expression dark. "We've got a cabin up north. Remote. No one will find you there. It's the safest place for now." Forge nodded, turning back to Shauna. "We'll get you there tonight. The rest of us are going to figure out where your husband and his friends fit into all of this." They quickly packed up, heading out of the motel and onto the road. The ride was long, the sky darkening as they made their way into the dense forest. The road was rough, winding through the trees, but Forge kept his focus. He had made a promise to protect Maya, and he wasn't about to let her down. As they neared the cabin, Forge's thoughts turned to the next steps. The fight wasn't over. They had just scratched the surface. There were powerful people behind all of this, people who would stop at nothing to get what they wanted. And Forge wasn't going to let them win. They arrived at the cabin and quickly secured the area, making sure that Shauna and Maya were safe inside. Forge knew they had a little time before the enemy came after them again. It was only a matter of time before they realized Maya's stepfather was out of their reach. "We've got work to do," Forge said, gathering his crew around him. "We need to find out who these people really are, and we need to make sure they can't hurt anyone else." The crew nodded in agreement. Storm, Inferno, Phantom, and the others had been through countless battles together, but this felt different. This wasn't just about protecting a girl. It was about stopping something much darker. The team moved quickly, splitting up to gather information. Forge stayed behind to keep an eye on Maya and her mother. As he stood outside the cabin, looking out over the quiet woods, his mind raced with questions. Who was the man they had seen by the fire? What was his role in all of this? And why was Maya's stepfather so determined to protect him? Forge knew the answers were out there. They just had to find them before it was too late. The next morning, the cabin was eerily quiet. Maya and her mother, Shauna, were still asleep, but Forge knew they didn't have much time before the storm hit. The rest of the Thunder Wolves had spent the night preparing, securing the perimeter, and gathering information. The calm before the storm never lasted long. Forge stood by the window, his gaze fixed on the trees outside. He had promised to protect Maya and her mother, and he wasn't about to let them down now. But he knew the danger was far from over. The people they were dealing with were powerful and ruthless. Maya's stepfather wasn't just a random bad guy. He was connected to something much bigger. The tall man by the fire, the one who had spoken about the deal and the land, was a key player. Forge could feel it in his gut. This wasn't just a criminal operation. It was an organized network with far-reaching influence. We need to move, Forge muttered to himself, his mind racing through their options. He grabbed his phone and dialed Storm, the one person he trusted to think as strategically as he did. Storm, get over here. We need to talk. It wasn't long before Storm, Inferno, and Phantom arrived. The trio entered the cabin, their expressions serious. They didn't waste time with pleasantries. What do we know? Forge asked, looking each of them in the eye. We dug into the miners, Storm said, his voice low. They're not just mining for resources. They're covering up something. A lot of something. Land deals, illegal business practices, even murder. The miner is connected to a larger syndicate, and it's got ties to people in high places. Your man, Maya's stepfather, is the perfect middleman. Forge's jaw tightened. I knew it. He's been working for them all along. We've also found out that they're trying to move some serious goods. They've been using the land as a cover for something much darker, Inferno added, his eyes narrowing. We've got to stop them before they make their next move. What's the plan? Forge asked. We confront them, Phantom said. We go to the mine, find the evidence, and take down whoever we can. But we need to move fast. Forge nodded. We're not just going in there to scare them. We need solid evidence to bring this down. If we get caught in a firefight, we'll be risking lives. Maya and Shauna need to be safe while we handle this. We'll get in and get out, Storm confirmed. But we need to be smart. We're not taking any unnecessary risks. Forge turned to look at the cabin, where Maya and Shauna were still sleeping. This isn't just about taking down a few bad guys. This is about stopping something much bigger. If we let this go, more people are going to get hurt. Maya's stepfather might have been the tip of the iceberg, but we're going after the whole damn thing. The group gathered their gear, making sure their weapons were ready. They knew the risks, but there was no turning back now. The mission was set. As they prepared to leave, Maya came out of the cabin, her eyes red from lack of sleep, but filled with determination. Are you going after him? She asked quietly, her voice barely audible. Forge knelt down to her level, his expression softening. We're going to make sure he can't hurt anyone else, Maya. You don't have to worry about him anymore. Maya's eyes filled with tears, but she nodded, knowing that she had no other choice but to trust the bikers. Be careful, she whispered, her voice trembling. I don't want anyone to get hurt. Forge's heart ached as he looked at the young girl. She had already seen too much, experienced too much. But there was no time to dwell on that now. We'll be back before you know it, he said, his voice reassuring. He stood up, turned to the crew, and nodded. Let's move out. The Thunderwolves mounted their bikes, the engines roaring to life, and headed toward the mine. The landscape was bleak and barren as they rode, the trees growing thinner as they neared their destination. Forge's mind raced with thoughts of the battle to come. The mine was heavily guarded, and they would be walking right into the heart of danger. But he wasn't backing down. They had to stop this, no matter what. The Thunderwolves pulled up to the outskirts of the mine, parking their bikes in a cluster of trees just out of sight. They dismounted quickly, moving in silence, their boots crunching softly on the dry ground. We stick together, Forge ordered, his voice low but firm. No one gets separated. We're here to get the evidence, not start a war. The crew nodded, their faces hard with determination. As they made their way closer to the mine, Forge felt the weight of the situation pressing down on him. The smell of dust and metal hung heavy in the air, and the sound of machinery humming in the distance was a constant reminder of what they were up against. They reached the fence that surrounded the mine, a tall, rusty structure that seemed to go on forever. Forge signaled for everyone to stop. "We need to find a way in without alerting them," he whispered. Phantom motioned toward a small hole in the fence, barely big enough for one person to slip through. "That'll do," Forge said. "Let's move." They crawled through the hole one by one, keeping their movements quiet and deliberate. Once inside, Forge led the crew toward the main building, their eyes scanning the surroundings for any signs of movement. The mine was a hive of activity, workers moving in and out of the building, but Forge knew they didn't have much time before the guards realized something was wrong. They had to act fast. "We get to the office," Forge said, "and find whatever we can. No matter what happens, we don't leave until we have the proof we need." They moved forward, their steps synchronized, as the tension in the air grew thicker with each passing second. The crew moved with quiet precision, staying low to the ground as they made their way toward the main office of the mine. The sound of heavy machinery was constant, a reminder that they were walking into the heart of the operation. Forge could feel the weight of the mission pressing down on him. This wasn't just about stopping a few men from making shady deals anymore. It was about uncovering the truth, about bringing down a network that had been operating in the shadows for too long. As they reached the door to the main building, Forge signaled for everyone to stop. The door was guarded, two men standing watch, but their attention was focused elsewhere, towards the workers unloading supplies from a truck. Forge motioned for Storm and Inferno to take care of the guards. "Quietly," he whispered. Storm nodded, his massive frame moving with a surprising grace as he approached the guards from behind. Inferno followed closely, ready to act if needed. The two men struck swiftly, each guard going down without a sound. Storm dragged one behind a stack of crates, while Inferno made sure the other guard was secured. "Clear," Storm muttered as he rejoined the group. Forge gave a sharp nod, his heart pounding. They couldn't afford any mistakes. "Move in," Forge ordered. They slipped into the building, the cool air inside a welcome change from the heat outside. The mine's interior was dimly lit, with long metal walkways and narrow aisles filled with equipment. Forge led the way, his eyes scanning every corner, every shadow. They reached the office door, a simple metal entry with a small window, and Forge motioned for Phantom to check the lock. Phantom moved forward, his fingers quick and skilled, working the lock with precision. With a soft click, the door swung open. Inside, the office was small and cramped, filled with old filing cabinets and dusty shelves. A desk sat in the middle of the room, papers strewn across it. Forge stepped inside, followed by the others. "Start searching," he ordered. Storm immediately began rifling through the drawers of the desk, while Inferno scanned the room for any hidden files. Phantom moved to the shelves, pulling down boxes and sifting through them. The air was thick with tension as the minutes ticked by. They needed something concrete, something that would tie all of this together. "Got something," Phantom called out, holding up a stack of papers. Forge moved quickly to his side, his heart racing. The documents were filled with names, dates, and large sums of money, payments for land deals, bribes, and other shady transactions. The names of people Maya's stepfather had been meeting with appeared again and again. It was all starting to come together. "This is it," Forge said, his voice low. "This is the proof we need." He grabbed the papers from Phantom's hands, quickly flipping through them. "We take these back to the others. We've got enough to bring down the whole operation." But just as he was about to turn to leave, a noise came from outside the office. Footsteps, hurried and heavy, approaching the door. "We've got company," Storm whispered, his voice tense. "Get ready," Forge growled. He motioned for everyone to take cover, ducking behind the desk as the door swung open. A man stepped inside, his face stern, his eyes scanning the room. Forge's heart skipped a beat as he recognized him, one of the men who had been speaking with Maya's stepfather. "What are you doing here?" the man asked, his voice cold. The crew tensed, but Forge knew they couldn't afford to get caught. Not now. Not when they were so close. With a swift move, Forge stood up, pulling his gun from its holster. "Get out," Forge said, his voice low and commanding. The man froze, his eyes widening as he saw the gun pointed directly at him. I don't think you want to find out what happens if you don't. The man's hand moved toward his own sidearm. But before he could draw, Inferno was on him, tackling him to the ground with a force that left the man gasping for breath. We don't want any trouble, Inferno muttered, his voice calm but firm. But you're going to stay down. Forge's eyes darted to the door, listening for any more movement. We need to get out of here. Now. Storm and Phantom quickly gathered the papers, shoving them into a bag. Forge kept his eyes on the downed man, making sure he stayed subdued. Get to the bikes, Forge ordered. The crew moved quickly, securing the man and tying him up before heading out of the office and back toward the exit. The tension was palpable as they moved through the mine, their footsteps echoing in the silence. The sound of the machines outside was growing louder, but they knew they didn't have much time. Once they were outside, Forge looked at the crew. We've got what we came for, he said, his voice steady. But this isn't over yet. We've got a bigger fight ahead. We get back to the cabin, we plan our next move. The group nodded, their faces set with determination. The ride back was quick, the wind in their faces as they sped toward the cabin. Forge's thoughts were focused on what they had learned. They had the proof now, the evidence that could take down this entire operation. But there was still one question that haunted him. What was Maya's stepfather really involved in? And who else was behind this operation? As they pulled into the cabin, Forge knew that they had to be ready for anything. The storm was just beginning. The cabin was quiet when the Thunder Wolves returned, the weight of their mission pressing down on every one of them. The documents they had found at the mine were secured, hidden in a bag that Forge kept close to him. Inside those papers was everything they needed to bring down the operation. The proof of illegal land deals, bribes, and connections to powerful people who had been pulling the strings behind the scenes. But even as they sat around the dimly lit room, Forge couldn't shake the feeling that they had only uncovered the tip of the iceberg. He couldn't stop thinking about Maya's stepfather, the man who had dragged her into this mess. He had been playing a dangerous game, and Forge knew that his connections were far-reaching. As the bikers gathered, Forge addressed the group. We've got what we came for, he said, his voice steady but filled with urgency. But this isn't over. We've got to go after the ones who are really pulling the strings. Maya's stepfather is just a pawn in this whole operation. The people behind him, those are the ones we need to focus on. So what's the plan? Storm asked, his voice low, his face shadowed with concern. We know they're trying to cover their tracks, Forge replied, pacing back and forth in front of the group. They won't stop until they think they've silenced everyone. We can't let that happen. We need to find out who's really running the show. I have a feeling this whole thing is bigger than just the mining deal. Inferno, who had been quiet until now, spoke up. We need more than just these papers. We need something that will tie everything together. We need to hit them where it hurts. Forge nodded, agreeing with Inferno. Exactly. And that's why we need to hit fast. We need to get into their inner circle, find out who they've been working with, and take them down. The room fell silent as the bikers processed the plan. Each of them knew the risks. The people they were dealing with were dangerous, too dangerous to let live, but too powerful to bring down without the right evidence. We're going after their money, Forge continued. Follow the trail, and it will lead us to the people at the top. If we can get to them, we can bring down the whole operation. Phantom, the strategist of the group, stood up. I've been looking through the documents we found, he said, his voice sharp and focused. There are names in here, people tied to these land deals. There's also a mention of a bank account, one that's been used to funnel money for these operations. It's a start. Good, Forge said, turning to Phantom. Give me the full details. Storm, Inferno, you're with me. We're going to hit that bank tomorrow. Get everything we can. What about Maya and Shauna? Storm asked, his brow furrowed with concern. We can't leave them alone. Forge looked over at the women, who had been quiet since they returned to the cabin. Maya and Shauna had stayed out of the way, but it was clear to Forge that they were both scared, uncertain of what was coming next. I'll make sure they're safe, Forge said. You two stay with them. Keep them hidden. If anything goes wrong, we don't want them in the crossfire. Shauna nodded from the corner, her face pale but determined. You're not going to let them hurt her, are you? She asked, her voice shaking. Forge met her gaze and nodded. Not if I can help it. The next morning, the Thunder Wolves geared up for their mission. The air was cold, the wind biting as they prepared their bikes and checked their weapons. The bank was in a small town, not far from the mine, and it was their best lead. If the money was being funneled through there, they'd find the key to unraveling everything. We move fast, Forge said, his eyes cold with resolve. No messing around. In and out. We don't give them time to react. As they rode toward the town, Forge's thoughts kept circling back to Maya's stepfather. He couldn't stop wondering how deep this went, how far these people were willing to go to protect their operation. They couldn't afford to underestimate them. The bank was a small, unassuming building nestled between a diner and a hardware store. There were no guards, no obvious security, but Forge knew better than to take things at face value. They parked their bikes a block away, moving in quietly. Phantom led the way, his eyes scanning the surroundings as he approached the front door. He pulled out a set of lockpicks and went to work, while Forge and the others kept watch. "We're going to need to be quick," Forge muttered, his gaze fixed on the street. They could be onto us already. The lock clicked open, and Phantom pushed the door open, motioning for the others to follow. The bank's interior was dark and quiet, the air thick with the scent of old paper and dust. "We need to find the vault," Forge said. "That's where they're hiding the big money." They moved quickly through the building, their footsteps soft on the worn carpet. The vault was located at the back, behind a heavy steel door. Forge didn't hesitate. He gave the signal, and Storm and Inferno quickly set to work on the door, using a small cutting tool to breach the lock. It took only minutes, but it felt like hours as Forge watched the door slowly give way. Finally, with a loud click, the door swung open. Inside, stacks of cash and files were piled high. Forge's heart raced as he stepped inside, scanning the room for anything that could lead them to the people behind it all. "This is it," Forge said, his voice low. "Let's take everything we can. This is the proof we need." As they gathered the files and documents, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway. Forge's blood ran cold. "We've got company," he said, his voice sharp. "Get ready." They quickly gathered the last of the documents, but just as they were about to leave, the sound of a gunshot rang out, followed by voices shouting from the hallway. Forge's mind raced as he motioned for everyone to move. They had to get out, but the real danger was just beginning. The sound of footsteps grew louder as Forge and his crew scrambled to gather the documents and cash from the vault. Their hearts were pounding, adrenaline flooding their veins. Storm grabbed a stack of papers, Inferno stuffed bundles of cash into a bag, and Phantom was already securing a few critical files that had names, bank accounts, and illegal transactions written all over them. But the sound of shouting and rapid footsteps down the hallway told them they were running out of time. "Move," Forge barked. "We need to get out now." They sprinted down the hallway, the sound of their boots echoing off the walls. The moment they reached the back door, Forge held up his hand. "Wait," he whispered sharply. "We need a plan. They're waiting for us." The crew halted immediately, their eyes scanning the alley behind the bank. They had made it this far without anyone noticing, but that was about to change. The gang had caught up, and now they would have to face the consequences of their intrusion. "We can't let them catch us," Storm said, his voice low but urgent. "We need a diversion." "I'll cover the rear," Phantom said, his eyes focused and calculating. "I'll make sure no one follows us down the alley. You guys take the front and get to the bikes." Forge nodded, his mind already working out the logistics. "We'll be quick. No unnecessary fights." The plan was set. Forge and the others darted out of the back door, slipping into the narrow alley. The sun was beginning to set, and the shadows in the alley grew longer as they made their way toward the bikes. The Thunderwolves had parked them strategically, hidden behind a stack of old crates near the end of the alley, a place where they could escape unnoticed. But as they reached the end, the sound of sirens began to blare in the distance. The authorities had arrived. "They're not going to make this easy," Inferno muttered under his breath. "We need to move faster." Forge motioned to Storm and Inferno. "Go. Now." They rushed toward their bikes, the roar of the engines filling the night air as they revved them to life. The sound was deafening, but it wasn't enough to drown out the footsteps coming closer. Forge was the last to reach his bike, hopping onto the seat just as a figure appeared at the end of the alley. Maya's stepfather. He was standing there, a pistol in hand, his face twisted in anger. "You're not getting away," he yelled, his voice carrying through the alley. Forge's heart skipped a beat, but he didn't hesitate. With a swift motion, he gunned the engine, and the bike roared to life. "Move," he shouted as he sped down the alley, the rest of the Thunderwolves following suit. Behind them, Maya's stepfather fired off a shot, the sound of it ringing through the night air. But it was too late. The Thunder Wolves were already gone, weaving in and out of the narrow streets as they raced toward safety. They knew they couldn't stop. Not yet. They needed to put as much distance between themselves and the bank as possible. The sirens were getting louder now, and Forge knew they couldn't outrun the law forever. "We need to lose them," Storm said, glancing over his shoulder at the flashing lights. "They'll be on our tail in no time." "We take the back roads," Forge said. "They won't expect us to go off the grid." The group turned down a narrow street, their bikes bouncing over the uneven pavement as they sped toward the outskirts of town. The streets were quieter here, and the buildings fewer, but Forge knew the area well. These were the back roads, long, winding, and full of shortcuts. If anyone could shake the police, it was them. They raced through the darkness, the sound of their engines echoing off the walls of the empty streets. The wind whipped past Forge's face as he leaned into the turns, pushing the bike faster. They had to stay ahead of the law, but even more importantly, they needed to get those documents to the authorities before anyone else could make a move. They didn't stop until they reached a secluded cabin miles away from town, hidden deep in the woods. The place was run down, but it had everything they needed: seclusion, safety, and a place to plan their next move. As they pulled in, Forge cut the engine and dismounted. The rest of the crew did the same, their eyes scanning the surroundings as they made sure no one had followed them. They didn't have much time. The sirens were still fresh in their ears, the law not far behind. But this was their moment. They had the documents. They had the proof they needed to bring down the entire operation. The next step was to deliver it to the right people, the ones who could do something about it. "We're here," Forge said, his voice firm, determined. "But this isn't over. We've got one last step to take." The crew nodded, each of them knowing what had to be done. They had come this far. They couldn't stop now. They would finish what they started, no matter the cost. As they huddled together to make their plans, Forge couldn't help but think of Maya. She had been through so much already. But this was her chance for a new life, free from the fear that had plagued her for so long. And the Thunder Wolves were going to make sure she got it. Forge stood tall, his resolve unwavering. "We're not leaving until we take down this whole operation," he said, his voice carrying the weight of everything they had fought for. "Let's finish this." The sun was setting, casting long shadows over the cabin as Forge and the crew gathered around a rough wooden table, the stolen documents spread out before them. The room was quiet, filled only with the sound of the crackling fire in the corner and the occasional rustling of papers. Maya and Shauna were in another room, staying out of sight, as Forge and his crew went through the evidence they had gathered. The papers, though disorganized, held the key to ending the syndicate's operation. Forge's heart beat with anticipation, but he knew they had to be careful. The last thing they needed was for the wrong people to find out what they had. "This is it," Forge said, his voice steady but filled with resolve. "We've got the proof. We know where the money's going, who's involved, and who's been pulling the strings. But this isn't just about bringing down a few criminals. We're dealing with people who have power, people who won't go down easy." "So what now?" Storm asked, his tone heavy with the weight of the decision. "We take this to the authorities," Forge replied, glancing at the documents once more. "We don't just hand it over to anyone, though. We need to be smart about this. We need to make sure the right people get their hands on it, and that those who are connected to this operation can't stop us." Phantom, who had been studying the documents closely, looked up. "We've got names here, people in high places. Cops, politicians, business leaders. The network is bigger than we thought. If we go public, we'll have to be prepared for everything." "I'm not backing down now," Forge said, his voice sharp. "We've come this far, and we're not stopping until it's finished. We'll get the information to the right people. We just need to be ready for what comes next." As Forge spoke, the weight of what they were about to do sank in. They had the power to bring down a corrupt system, but doing so would put them all in danger. Still, Forge's resolve remained unshaken. He had made a promise to protect Maya, and he intended to keep it. "We can't do this alone," Inferno said. "We need backup. We need the right people in our corner if we're going to make it out of this alive." Forge nodded in agreement. "We've got a few allies in high places, but we'll need more than that. This isn't just about taking down a few bad guys. It's about exposing an entire network that's been operating in the shadows for far too long." Storm stood up, his muscles rippling under his leather jacket. "We've got your back, Forge. We've been through worse. We'll finish this together." With that, the crew made their plans. They needed to get the evidence to the authorities, but they couldn't just walk into the nearest police station and hand it over. They had to be strategic. Forge and Phantom would take the lead, getting the documents into the hands of the right people. Storm and Inferno would provide backup, making sure nothing went wrong. They spent the next few hours preparing, checking their gear, and going over every detail. Forge couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. They had to move fast. As the crew mounted their bikes and prepared to leave, Forge gave one last look at the cabin where Maya and Shauna were waiting. He could see the fear in Maya's eyes when they left, but he knew this was their only chance. If they succeeded, Maya would finally be safe. If they failed, they might all be in danger. The ride to the city was long, the wind whipping past them as they sped down the dark roads. The tension was palpable, but Forge kept his focus. They couldn't afford any mistakes now. As they approached the city, they stopped at a small diner on the outskirts. Forge and Phantom went inside to meet with their contact, a trusted informant who had worked with them in the past. The others stayed outside, watching for any signs of trouble. Inside the diner, Forge exchanged quick words with their contact, a man named Riggins. He was well-connected, and he knew how to get things done without drawing attention. "I've got everything we need," Riggins said, his voice low. "But it's going to take time. I can't promise anything right away. There's too much heat on this." "We don't have time," Forge replied, his voice tense. "We need action now. We've got everything we need to take down the operation, but we need to make sure the right people get it. This isn't just about taking down some criminals. It's about stopping a much bigger threat." Riggins nodded. "I'll make sure it gets in the right hands. But you're going to have to trust me. It's going to get messy." Forge hesitated, but nodded. "I'm counting on you. Don't let anyone get in the way." As they walked out of the diner, Forge felt the weight of what they had just set in motion. The next few days would be crucial. They had given Riggins the evidence, but they had no idea what was waiting for them. The fight wasn't over yet. As they returned to the cabin, the air felt heavier than before. Maya and Shauna were waiting inside, but Forge knew that they still weren't safe. The wheels were in motion, but the danger wasn't over. They had one shot at this, and Forge wasn't about to let anyone stand in their way. "We've done what we can," Forge said, his voice steady but filled with urgency. "Now we wait." The next move was in the hands of those who could take down the operation, but Forge knew they had done everything they could to ensure justice would be served. The real battle was just beginning. The next few days were tense. Forge and the crew stayed in the cabin, their nerves frayed as they waited for any word from Riggins. The evidence was in the right hands now, but Forge couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to go terribly wrong. The silence in the cabin was suffocating. Maya and Shauna kept to themselves, still recovering from the shock of everything that had happened. Maya, who had once been full of fear, now seemed to carry a quiet determination in her eyes, a quiet strength that Forge respected. But that didn't mean the danger was gone. In fact, it felt like the calm before a storm. "We're sitting ducks here," Storm muttered one evening as he paced around the cabin. "We've got the proof, but we're not doing anything with it. We're waiting for them to make the first move." Forge glanced over at him, his face hard but thoughtful. "We're waiting for the right moment," he said, his voice firm. "We did the hard part. We got the evidence. Now we let them make their move. The last thing we need is to go in blind and get caught off guard. We're not taking unnecessary risks." Storm stopped pacing, his eyes narrowing. "I get it. But you've got to understand, Forge, we've been taking risks from the moment we decided to help Maya. And if we just sit here, waiting for someone else to do something, we might miss our chance. The people behind this thing, your ex-cop buddy, they're not going to sit still. They're going to come after us." Forge knew Storm was right. The longer they stayed hidden, the more time the syndicate had to cover their tracks, to silence the people who were involved, and to stop anyone who had the evidence. The weight of the decision was heavy. It wasn't just about keeping Maya and Shauna safe anymore. It was about taking down the entire operation. If they failed now, everything they had done so far would have been for nothing. "We need to make sure we're prepared," Forge said after a moment of silence. "We've got everything we need. We've got the names, the connections. We've just got to figure out how to bring this down without getting ourselves killed." As Forge spoke, his eyes flickered to the bag that contained the documents. The proof was there, everything they needed. But the danger was real. The people they were dealing with were connected, powerful, and ruthless. And Maya's stepfather was still a wild card, someone who had already shown he would go to extreme lengths to protect his ties. How long do you think we've got? Phantom asked quietly from the corner, his voice calm but calculating. Forge's mind raced. He knew the answer, but he didn't want to admit it. Not long, he replied, his voice hardening. The moment they realize we've got the documents, they'll make their move. They'll try to silence us. We have to act before they do. And we're going to do it how? Inferno asked, his voice low and filled with intensity. We don't just hit them head on. We're too exposed here. We need to strike at their operations, find the weak spots, and hit fast. We can't wait for them to come for us. Forge looked at each of his crew, his mind made up. We've got one shot at this. We take out their resources, destroy their operations, before they can retaliate. And we take out the man who's been controlling it all. We end this. The crew nodded in agreement. They had been through the worst, but they all knew this next move was the most dangerous. They were going after the heart of the syndicate, the people who had been using corruption and violence to manipulate everything in their path. Forge stood up, a fierce determination in his eyes. We don't do this alone. We bring in the people who can help us. We get the local authorities involved. But we don't just hand them the evidence. We make sure we've got the backup we need. No more games. This is the final play. It was settled. The Thunderwolves would bring their fight to the syndicate, but they would need a plan, and they would need help. They couldn't fight this battle on their own. Forge knew the fight wasn't just about taking down a few criminals. This was about exposing a system of corruption that had been in place for too long. The more he thought about it, the more the pieces began to fall into place. They had the proof, and now they had the means to end it. But it wouldn't be easy. Forge's mind shifted to the road ahead, knowing that once they made their move, there would be no turning back. As they began to finalize their plans, the door to the cabin creaked open. Maya stepped inside, her face drawn but determined. "What are you going to do?" she asked, her voice steady but soft. Forge looked at her, his heart aching for the young girl who had already been through so much. "We're going to finish what we started. We're going to make sure that no one ever hurts you or your mom again. We're going to take them down, one way or another." Maya nodded, her eyes steady. "I trust you," she said simply. The crew exchanged glances, each of them knowing the stakes. They weren't just fighting for their own survival anymore. They were fighting for justice, for the people who couldn't fight back, for the ones who had been oppressed by the corruption of powerful men. Forge turned back to the group, his jaw set in determination. "Let's get to work. This ends now." With that, they set their plan into motion, the final phase of their mission beginning. The Thunderwolves were about to take the fight directly to the syndicate, and they weren't going to stop until it was finished. The plan was set. The Thunderwolves knew their next move was critical, and Forge wasn't about to let anything stand in their way. They had everything they needed, the proof, the determination, and a solid plan. But as the hours passed, Forge couldn't help but feel the weight of what was coming. This wasn't just another fight. It was the culmination of everything they had done up to this point, everything they had risked. They had to hit hard, and they had to do it fast. As the crew finalized their plan, Forge made one last check on Maya and Shauna, making sure they were secure. They were staying in the cabin for now, hidden and protected. Forge had promised to keep them safe, and he wasn't about to break that promise. Maya had been quiet, her thoughts seemingly occupied with everything that had happened. But there was something in her eyes, a resilience, a determination, that reminded Forge of why they were doing this. They weren't just fighting for justice. They were fighting for people like Maya, who deserved to live without fear. Forge knew they had to move quickly. The longer they stayed in one place, the more likely it was that the syndicate would catch on to what was happening. The threat wasn't over, not by a long shot. As the team geared up for their next step, Forge gathered the crew together one final time. The plan was simple. They would hit the syndicate's operations, cut off their resources, and make sure the authorities were ready to take action. But there was a catch. They couldn't afford to be reckless. They couldn't afford to make a mistake. "Once we make our move, there's no turning back," Forge said, his voice steady but filled with determination. "We hit them where it hurts. No hesitation, no second guessing. We're doing this for the right reasons. We're taking down these people, and we're making sure they can't hurt anyone again." The crew nodded, their faces set with resolve. They had been through this kind of mission before, but this time, it felt different. This time, It wasn't just about stopping a few bad guys. It was about dismantling an entire system of corruption. "Let's move out," Forge ordered, and the crew made their way to the bikes, ready for the ride ahead. They knew the stakes. The ride was long, and the road was treacherous. But Forge's mind was focused on the goal ahead. They had the proof, the evidence, and the plan. All they had to do now was execute it. As they rode toward the target location, Forge's thoughts drifted back to Maya's stepfather. The man was a puppet in this whole operation, but he had the connections to make things difficult. He wasn't going to give up easily, and neither were the people who backed him. Forge's grip on the handlebars tightened. This was it. They were finally going to face the people who had been pulling the strings. The group arrived at the location just before dawn. The area was quiet, the silence only broken by the rumbling of their motorcycles as they parked in a secluded spot. Forge looked around, his eyes scanning the surroundings. The place looked like a rundown industrial complex, tucked away in the middle of nowhere. It was perfect for the syndicate's operations, out of sight, out of mind. But it wouldn't stay hidden for long. "We move fast, and we move quiet," Forge said, his voice low. "We're not here to make noise. We're here to shut this operation down for good." The crew spread out, each of them taking positions around the complex. Forge, Storm, and Inferno would go in first, taking out any guards they encountered and securing the building. Phantom and the rest of the crew would cover their backs, making sure no one snuck up on them. The plan was simple, but Forge knew it wouldn't be easy. As they approached the entrance, Forge's heart rate increased. This was the moment they had been preparing for. The door to the building was unguarded, but Forge didn't trust it. He motioned for Storm and Inferno to flank the sides of the building, while Phantom stayed at the rear. Forge stepped forward, his hand resting on the door handle, his breath steady. They were in. The building was dark and smelled of oil and metal. The faint sound of machinery hummed in the distance. They moved quietly through the hallways, keeping their steps light, their weapons ready. As they turned the corner, they saw them, men in dark clothing, standing guard. Without a word, Storm and Inferno took them out in seconds, moving like shadows. Forge's eyes never left the path ahead, his mind focused on the task at hand. "Clear," Storm whispered, and Forge nodded. They continued deeper into the building, making their way toward the heart of the operation. But as they neared the main room, Forge stopped in his tracks. He could hear voices, low, murmuring, but they weren't alone anymore. The men inside the room were discussing something. Forge motioned for everyone to stay silent, his senses on high alert. They had to make their move before the syndicate realized they were there. The door was just ahead, and Forge's heart raced as they prepared to breach the room. The next few seconds felt like an eternity, but finally, Forge pushed the door open, and they were inside. The men in the room didn't see them coming. The Thunderwolves moved with precision, taking down the guards one by one. But there was one man left, Maya's stepfather. He was standing at the far end of the room, talking to someone on the phone. The moment he saw Forge, his eyes went wide with shock and recognition. "You think you've won?" he spat, his hand reaching for a gun. "This isn't over. You'll never get away with this." But Forge didn't flinch. "We already have," he said, stepping forward. The fight was far from over, but the Thunderwolves had made their move. And this time, they weren't backing down. Forge stood in the middle of the room, eyes locked on Maya's stepfather as he backed away slowly, his hand still hovering over his gun. The tension was thick in the air, almost suffocating. Maya's stepfather had always been a figure of authority in her life, but now, in this moment, he was nothing more than a desperate man trying to hold on to a life that was slipping away. "You don't understand," he muttered, his voice shaking with a mix of anger and fear. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." "I know exactly who you are," Forge replied, his voice calm, but with an edge of steel in it. "You're a part of a system that hurts people, that uses power to crush anyone in its way. But you're not getting away with it anymore." Maya's stepfather sneered, taking another step back, his fingers curling around the handle of the gun. "You think you can just take me down? You think you're above the law?" "We've been above the law for too long," Forge shot back, taking a step forward. "And you've been hiding behind it, using it to protect yourself and your shady deals. Not anymore." Without warning, Maya's stepfather lunged toward the gun, but before he could reach it, Storm was on him. The big man grabbed him by the arm, twisting it behind his back, and forced him to the floor with a loud thud. I don't think so, Storm growled, his grip like iron. We're not done yet. Maya's stepfather struggled against the hold, but it was useless. Inferno stepped forward, his face hard, and grabbed the gun from the man's hand, tossing it across the room. You're done, Inferno said coldly. No more threats. The room fell silent as the crew gathered around, their eyes never leaving the defeated man on the floor. Forge stepped forward, crouching down in front of Maya's stepfather, his face inches from the man's. It's over. You're done. You and your people can't hide anymore. Maya's stepfather's eyes flickered with rage, but there was also a sense of fear now. He realized the gravity of the situation. You don't know who I work for, he hissed. You can't stop them. You won't win. Forge didn't flinch. We already have. We've got everything we need to take down the whole operation. You're just the first domino to fall. Maya's stepfather's face twisted in frustration, but Forge saw something else in his eyes, defeat. For the first time, the man realized that he wasn't in control anymore. You'll never get away with this, he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. Someone will come for you. Let them come, Forge said with a cold smile. We've got the evidence. And we've got the law on our side. Your game is over. Storm held him down as Forge turned to the rest of the crew. It's time to finish this. We need to get these documents to the authorities and make sure they don't get destroyed. We have to make sure the right people see them, and that no one else can cover this up. Inferno picked up the bag of documents and nodded. We've got it. We'll get them to the right people. Forge's eyes flickered to Maya, who was standing near the door, watching the scene unfold. She was silent, her face a mixture of relief and something else, something Forge couldn't quite place. He knew she had seen too much, but now, she was free. Free from her stepfather's control, free from the fear that had hung over her for so long. Forge walked over to her, placing a hand on her shoulder. It's over, Maya. You're safe now. She looked up at him, her eyes filled with gratitude, but also with something deeper, something that Forge couldn't quite define. Thank you, she whispered. For everything. Forge gave her a reassuring smile. You don't need to thank me. We're here to protect you. That's what we do. Maya nodded, but her expression was distant, as though she was still processing everything that had happened. Forge could see the weight of it all on her, and he knew that while this chapter of her life was ending, it wasn't the end of her journey. There was a long road ahead, one that would take time for her to heal and rebuild. But Forge knew she was stronger than she realized. As the crew made preparations to leave the building, Forge turned to Storm and Inferno. We're moving out. We've got to get this information to the authorities before anyone else can interfere. Let's go. The crew nodded, and they began to make their way out of the building. Maya's stepfather was left behind, powerless and alone, a symbol of everything that had been wrong with the system they were trying to bring down. But as Forge and the others made their way through the city, they knew their mission wasn't over. They had won the battle, but the war was far from finished. They had exposed the syndicate, but now they had to make sure it stayed exposed. They couldn't stop until every last person involved was brought to justice. Let's finish this, Forge muttered under his breath, as they drove off into the night, ready for whatever came next. The next few days were a whirlwind. The crew had done it. They had exposed the syndicate and handed over the documents to the authorities. The evidence was irrefutable, and people in power were finally taking action. The media was all over the story, and soon, the corruption that had been festering for so long was being dragged out into the open. But as Forge watched the news coverage and saw the arrests begin, he knew the fight wasn't truly over. There were still those who would fight back, people who would try to cover their tracks, to make sure the operation didn't crumble completely. But for now, it was a victory. Maya and her mother were safe, finally free from the man who had controlled their lives for so long. Maya had been quiet, her emotions still raw from everything that had happened, but Forge could see the change in her. She was starting to heal, beginning to find a sense of peace that had been missing for far too long. He checked in on them regularly, making sure they had everything they needed and that they were staying out of harm's way. But even as Maya and Shauna began to find a new sense of normal, Forge couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen. He had been through too many close calls to believe that the danger had passed. There was always someone lurking in the shadows, someone who would want revenge. One evening, as the crew gathered at the cabin to discuss their next move, the door creaked open. Maya stepped inside, her face pale, her eyes wide with something Forge couldn't quite place. What's wrong? Forge asked immediately, his voice soft but filled with concern. Maya hesitated for a moment, glancing over her shoulder before stepping fully into the room. I heard something, she said, her voice trembling. I think they're coming for us. My stepfather, he's not done. The room fell silent. Forge's heart dropped into his stomach. How do you know? He asked. I overheard a conversation, Maya said, her eyes wide with fear. It was someone he was talking to on the phone. They said they weren't finished, that they would come after all of us. Forge stood up, his mind racing. We need to move, he said, turning to the crew. Pack up. We don't have time to waste. If they're coming for us, we need to be ready. The crew didn't hesitate. They had been through too much together, and they all knew what had to be done. Within minutes, they were on the road, the bikes roaring to life as they left the cabin behind. Forge could feel the weight of what they were about to do pressing down on him. They had to stay one step ahead of whatever was coming. As they rode through the night, Forge's mind kept racing. They had exposed the syndicate, but if Maya's stepfather was still out there, still in contact with these dangerous people, then their work wasn't done. They couldn't let their guard down. The road stretched out in front of them, dark and empty, but Forge knew they couldn't stop now. They had to keep moving. Hours passed as they rode, the cold night air biting at their skin. But Forge stayed focused, watching the road ahead, listening for any signs of danger. Eventually, they reached a secluded safe house that the crew had used in the past. It was isolated, hidden deep in the woods, the perfect place to lay low until they figured out what to do next. They parked their bikes and made their way inside, the familiar smell of old wood and dust greeting them as they entered. The crew gathered around the table, Forge's mind still racing. We can't wait any longer, Forge said, his voice low but firm. If Maya's stepfather is still working with them, we need to take him out before he can get to us. Agreed, Storm said, his voice rough with resolve. We're not letting him or anyone else get away with this. Inferno, who had been quiet until now, nodded. We've got everything we need. The evidence is still safe. We just need to take action. Forge looked at his crew, his heart heavy with the weight of the decisions ahead. He knew this wasn't over. They had made a powerful enemy, and that enemy wasn't going to stop until they were all taken down. We'll go after Maya's stepfather, Forge said, his voice hard. We get him, we get the answers. No more waiting. The crew nodded, their faces set with determination. Let's finish this, Phantom said, his eyes cold with resolve. The night stretched on as the crew made their final preparations. They knew this wasn't going to be easy, but Forge also knew they had no choice. They had come this far, and they weren't about to let everything they had fought for slip away. It was time to end this. With a final glance toward Maya and Shauna, Forge led the crew out the door. The fight wasn't over, but they were ready. The final chapter of their mission had begun, and they were going to see it through, no matter the cost.